Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Amy Sohn. Amy is a New York Times-bestselling author of 12 books. Her books have been published in 11 languages and on 5 continents. And today, we will speak about her latest book, The Men Who Hated Women: Sex, Censorship, and Civil Liberties in the Gilded Age. Amy, thank you so much for joining me.
This is delightful. I'm so glad to be with you.
You know, every time I read a book about the Gilded Age, I feel almost transported to a different universe because the laws were so different and the way of living so radically different from today. And at the same time, there are so many similarities. It's just like part of the states haven't moved on or haven't caught up with the 21st century. So we see parts of the Gilded Age in our everyday life today, mostly in the southern states, but it's just incredible that, you know, this should have been past of history and we shouldn't see anything similar to it nowadays. I wonder if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your life. I mean, you have written 12 books. That's a lot of writing. Is this something that you always wanted to do, to be a writer?
Well, you know, I look much younger than I am. So I started, my first novel was published when I was 20, had I turned 25? 25.
Amazing.
I fell into writing. I have, I guess, a somewhat atypical trajectory because we have this thing in the US of these, you know, MFA programs. And that was not my path. I always liked writing stories when I was a little kid, telling stories. I was a child actress, so I was exposed to very creative people from a young age, which was such great modeling for me. I didn't think about it until many years later, but to be around young people who are trying to make a living in the arts is very inspirational when you're too young to know what it is you want to do. I went to Brown University. I was interested in theater and I decided to concentrate. At Brown, we say concentrate instead of major. I concentrated in public policy. So actually, I guess I had always been interested in these, you know, these policy issues, how public policy affected people. I concentrated in public policy without thinking that I wanted to go into it. Most of my classmates had a plan to go to education school or to become lawyers. Instead, I moved to New York, back to my hometown in Brooklyn, New York, and tried to be an actress for a couple of years and found that my heart wasn't really in it, partly because you have no control over whether you get a job. Other people are in control of that. I didn't like the lack of power. So I started writing these autobiographical pieces for an alternative weekly called New York Press, which had kind of an exciting moment in the late 90s. And I got a column called Female Trouble, named after the John Waters film, that was mostly about my dating life, although no one told me it had to be. That was what I was most interested in writing about, was my frustration with guys my age. And it was funny and sad, mostly funny, but incredibly controversial because I was writing quite openly about the experiences I was having. Of course, I was constructing them, but they were being read as nonfiction. And through that, I got a contract to write my first novel when I was just in my early 20s, which became Run, Catch, Kiss, my first novel that was published by Simon & Schuster. And the kind of tagline we used for it was, it's about a sex columnist who can't get a date because every guy she wants to date is afraid she's going to write about him in her column. And through that, I then wrote 4 other novels, and I've written a couple of nonfiction books for other people. But this, The Man Who Hated Women, is my first work of narrative nonfiction.
And how do you stumble upon this subject?
That's an amazing story. I was looking for a new book to write. I was burnt out on novels, and I still am. I may return to it at some point. But I had published this book, The Actress, in 2014 and struggled a lot with the ending. And I thought, you know, I've always loved research. And I've always loved, I had gotten a little bit into genealogy for reasons that aren't very interesting, but I was starting to learn the tools of discovering things through the internet and searching intelligently. So I began doing what all narrative nonfiction writers do, which is called book hunting. And for weeks and sometimes months and sometimes years, you're assembling as much information as you can to try to come up with a book proposal. And I began to think about writing a book that dealt with women and insanity, because I had always been interested in the idea, the connection between the word hysteria and hysterectomy, the idea that being female meant to be crazy in different time periods. And I came across the story of Ida Craddock on the internet, who was this 19th century Philadelphian woman who was not able to get into the University of Pennsylvania because she was a woman, and began to hallucinate a sex ghost who visited her at night. And I became totally enchanted by her story. I, of course, read a book that had already been published about her called Heaven's Bride by Lee Eric Schmidt. And aside from the fact that someone had already written a book about her, I didn't think it was enough to try to write just about Ida Craddock. And when I discovered that she had tangled with Anthony Comstock, this 19th century post office inspector and secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, I kind of felt like I had these two really interesting characters of a woman at a time of social change for women who is trying to kind of carve out new ideas about who and what a woman could and should be, and a man who was this very archetypical American man who had descended from the Puritans, fought in the Civil War, and then moved to this large, wonderful city that I love of New York, and became completely freaked out by the amount of sex that was being peddled on the street. And so I thought, what if I could write a book about all of the women, or some of the women, who he had prosecuted, knowing that he went after far more men than women. But I was just really interested in telling the stories of these, what I call sex radicals. And once I had those two characters, then it just became a question of how am I going to find the other women? And so I started to do more research, and then, learned about Victoria Woodhall and her sister Tennessee Claflin, who were among the first. I learned about Madame Restel, the most notorious abortionist in New York. And then I learned about these other characters that no one's really written about before, hasn't really given them their rightful place, who are these kind of intellectual free lovers, free thinkers, whose ideas about sex and pleasure and reproduction are totally, totally modern, and could totally, as you were saying in your introduction, could totally apply today. They were concerned with the exact same things that people who care about women talk about today, which is, what is the economic effect of unwanted pregnancy and childbirth? Why isn't women's health considered a real national policy issue, international policy issue? How can marriages be made better? What role does equality of division of labor have in marital happiness? What is the relationship between reproductive access and internal liberation? And so I just absolutely fell in love with these women.
Wow. Before we get to the stories of the woman, how was this construct apply against men? You mentioned that a minute ago.
Well, there was already obscenity law before. Basically, what the Comstock law did was it classified birth control as obscenity. We had never had a law that regulated the selling and mailing of birth control information, that criminalized that. In terms of how it affected men, the very first men he went after, Anthony Comstock, were smutty booksellers. So it's interesting that the first work that he was really doing was focused on dirty books, dirty pictures. Lower Manhattan at the time was this absolutely just, there was sex everywhere in the form of sex workers selling themselves on the street, to books, pictures, everything you could imagine, to articles, from contraceptives to sex toys. And the first people he went after, were kind of typical for their time, just men trying to make a living who were publishing these kind of smutty books. But he also became very concerned about birth control and contraceptives, because he would pick up the newspapers, both mainstream newspapers like the New York Times and Tribune, and he would see these ads in the back for abortionists. And he became very upset that it was so easy to find abortionists. And he thought that the availability of abortion was destroying American families, and more specifically, destroying American young people. That it was encouraging, men and women to be morally irresponsible. And so his idea was, if you can cut off information, you can change behavior.
And what were the contraceptives of the time? How could a woman prevent abortion? I mean, the
prevent pregnancy, you mean?
Yes. Sorry.
No, it is very confusing, and Anthony Comstock was not totally clear on the difference between contraception and abortion, which is a very important distinction, because trying to prevent pregnancy has a totally different meaning. But so there were many more things available than you would think of. There were cervical caps, diaphragms, uterine elevators, which were things you would insert into the uterus, similar to an IUD today, to change the shape of the uterus and make implantation harder. Certainly condoms, rubber technology. One of the things I love about this book is the work that I did researching it is, I really feel like on some level it's about technological innovation and the way that changed the way people live, because the mail changed once trains got faster, and we were able to transport mail by train. Then it allowed mailing costs to become cheaper. When paper got lighter, cheaper to print, and there were new innovations in printing techniques, people could pass around small, smutty books, pictures, and that kind of thing. In terms of contraception, there were advances in what you could do with rubber, beginning in the 1840s with a guy named Charles Goodyear, whose name you might know from a tire on your car. And once that happened, we were able to have what was then called gonorrhea bags, which were rubbers, condoms, and condoms had a million different names. And then there were also all kinds of abortifacients and herbal contraceptives, which were various home remedies that in some cases were effective at either preventing conception or could bring on miscarriage. So it's really, people who think that there was no contraception at that time are wrong. One of the most popular articles that women utilized beginning around the 1840s was syringes, which were essentially a form of vaginal douche that you would apply after sex to try to flush out the sperm. And they wound up becoming very controversial after the Comstock Law was passed, because they weren't explicitly contraceptive. You could also use them for health and hygiene. So it was they were kind of this magical, article in the sense that you could always say that you only had one or only sold one for health and cleansing purposes, when we know that they were frequently used by women to try to prevent pregnancy following intercourse.
And according to the ideology of Comstock, you are supposed to only have sex to reproduce, to procreate, not for pleasure, neither for the man nor for the woman. Is that right?
I think he would have been okay with pleasure within the context of a marriage.
I see.
But yes, you were only supposed to have sex for reproduction. The idea of trying to prevent pregnancy was seen as violating the Bible.
And yeah, it's birth control. I guess birth control is illegal at this time. You could be put in jail for trying to prevent to have a baby.
Yeah, after the federal Comstock law was passed, one of the reasons it had such enormous power in this country was the states passed their own mini Comstock laws, which were referred to as little Comstock laws. And in many cases, they were more restrictive than the federal law itself. So in certain states, you weren't allowed to talk about how to prevent pregnancy. You weren't allowed to even do something as common in families as withdrawal or rhythm. You know, they didn't quite understand what times of the month were safer and less safe. But yes, birth control, which had enjoyed kind of a rich period from the 1840s to the 1870s, and also birth control information, suddenly was criminalized.
You know, the thing that is driving me crazy is that even today, there are some states that are preventing as much as possible sexual education. So there are little girls who had to find things through the internet, and God knows what they can find through the internet. You know, there are so many conflicting information. So I feel like we haven't evolved much, or many states haven't evolved to modern days education.
Yeah, and one of the things I learned from researching this was that in addition to criminalizing the mailing of articles like syringes, condoms, and things like that, one of the really most terrifying and far-reaching effects of the Comstock law was it made it much more difficult to mail information. So these were medical books by respected doctors, people who knew about physiology. Some of them were cagey about contraception. Some of them had incomplete information, but what a lot of them had in common was anatomy. And so you could read these books, you know, as like a young woman entering a marriage, you know, in your 20s, and it would show you your body and your partner's body. This later came to be called physiology, which I love. There's just so many different, you know, code words for sex ed, but his law had the effect of making it harder for ordinary people who didn't know anything and were starting marriages and families together to get practical information about what their bodies did, what adolescence was, how bodies changed over time. And also frequently these books had information about pregnancy and childbirth, for example, trying to have less pain during delivery. So it was not just items, physical items that were criminalized. It was really valuable information that people needed.
So in your book, you cover 8 female characters, and one of them is, Victoria, what's her last name?
Woodhall.
Woodhall, who also was a candidate for the U.S. presidency. Can you just tell us a little bit about her life?
Some broad strokes about,
yes,
about Victoria. Victoria Claflin Woodhall was raised in the Midwest in a large family. She and many of her siblings, including her sister Tennessee Claflin, were clairvoyants from a young age. Their father wanted to make money off of them, and they toured the country telling fortunes and doing things like laying their hands on people, selling elixirs, this kind of thing. This is in the years before and following the Civil War. And she and her sister moved to New York around the late 1860s and took the world by storm. They started the first female brokerage house at a time when women could not actually place trades. They had a man doing it for them, but they got a ton of publicity. They started a radical leftist newspaper called Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly that published the Communist Manifesto, also published George Sand, also just had all kinds of crazy ads for quack medicines. And when Victoria was 34, she ran for president of the United States on a ticket called the Equal Rights Party, with Frederick Douglass as her running mate, although his nomination was really a publicity stunt. He was never consulted, never campaigned for her, and did not vote for her. And they were just these crazy, bold, beautiful, controversial women who got in trouble with Comstock after in their newspaper they published 2 really lurid articles that contained frank sexual language.
Well, this is an amazing history, tales of this amazing woman. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you and find out what you're up to. I mean, 12 books and all of them seems very enticing as well.
And they're all very different. Yeah. So my book is called The Man Who Hated Women, Sex, Censorship, and Civil Liberties in the Gilded Age, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And I'm at amysohn.com. Sohn is my last name. And Twitter is Amy Sohn. Instagram is private right now. And this is one of a couple podcasts that I think will be coming out in the next couple of months. I'm probably going to be touring with the book a little bit later in the fall, hoping to do some more in-person events. So if you go to my website, you can find out about them.
Amy, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, this is great. It's so nice to meet you and talk to you.